For centuries, one tiny island nation was, for all intents and purposes, the world's #1 superpower. It was an industrial trailblazer with innovations that literally reshaped the globe. And its empire, so massive you've probably heard the saying, the sun never set on it. Until, well, one day it did. So that's the million-dollar question we're digging into here. How did a global empire that once held sway over a quarter of the world's population find itself, well, here? To get to the bottom of it, we actually have to start with right now, with the present day.
I mean, if you just glance at the headlines today, you see a picture of a country facing some really tough challenges. We're talking about periods of civil unrest, an economy that's been squeezed by crazy high inflation, and wages that just aren't keeping up. Poverty is becoming a huge issue again. And public services, like the beloved National Health Service, or NHS, they're stretched to the absolute breaking point. Culturally, you could argue that the influence from the whole Cool Britannia era feels like a lifetime ago. It's a pretty stark contrast to its former glory, right?
Okay, so to really understand the present, we've got to hit rewind. We're going way back to the beginning to see how this small island managed to become a global superpower in the first place.
Now, this didn't happen overnight. It was a slow burn over hundreds of years, where each success just built the foundation for the next big thing. It all started with sea power. Back in 1588, when they defeated the Spanish Armada, it was like the new kid on the block knocking out the toughest guy in the yard. That dominance on the seas let companies like the British East India Company take over global trade, and that money, in turn, paid for a massive colonial network, starting with Jamestown. And then, the game changer. James Watt's steam engine in the 1760s kicked off a revolution that changed literally everything.
You know, while bigger rivals like France and Spain had more land and more people, Britain had a secret weapon: its geography. Its position in the Atlantic was just a perfect hub for trade and a great spot for spying, making it super risky for enemy ships to even try to use the English Channel. That, plus its growing navy, allowed it to build and protect this huge colonial network that provided all the raw materials and the markets it needed to keep growing. And all these advantages just came together perfectly during the Industrial Revolution, earning Britain this incredible nickname, the workshop of the world. Because it was the first to industrialize, it was just pumping out most of the world's coal, iron, and textiles. The profits were absolutely immense, strengthening its banks and cementing its status as the world's top economic dog throughout the 1800s. But as that century ended, new powers were on the rise, and the stage was being set for a massive global showdown. And this brings us to the great turning point in our story. The 20th century, as we all know, saw 2 world wars. Britain was on the winning side both times. But victory, well, victory came at a price that would absolutely cripple the empire. Let's just talk numbers for a second, because they are staggering. The cost of World War I alone was around $35 billion back then. But in today's money, that's somewhere around $735 billion. The sheer amount of debt they had to take on to fund the war was just colossal. And World War II just made things so much worse. After that conflict ended, Britain's national debt had swelled to an unbelievable 270% of its entire economic output for the year. The financial devastation was just complete. Just think about that for a second. That reversal. In just a few decades, Britain went from being the world's bank to being one of its biggest borrowers. That single, massive shift is really the beginning of the end for the empire's financial dominance.
So, with the bank account empty and the empire starting to crumble, post-war Britain was staring down a brand new and pretty daunting challenge. What is our place in a world we no longer run?
And man, those post-war decades were turbulent. The end of the empire really kicked off with Indian independence in 1947, which cut off access to some major resources and markets. Back home, the industries that had powered the nation for a century, we're talking coal, steel, textiles, they were now outdated and just couldn't compete anymore. All of this led to economic chaos, and it all kind of boiled over in the 1970s with massive strikes during the winter of discontent, social unrest, and growing racial tensions.
But the story isn't just a simple, straight line of decline. Not at all. The contrast between these 2 decades says it all. The bleak, difficult 1970s gave way to this huge comeback in the 1990s, the era of Cool Britannia. The economy was booming, London became a major global financial hub. Culturally, Britain was on top of the world again with bands like Oasis and Blur, huge blockbuster movies, and this new sense of optimism from Tony Blair's new Labour government. It really seemed like Britain had successfully reinvented itself once again. But all that cool Britannia prosperity was also kind of hiding some growing tensions simmering just beneath the surface, which would eventually lead to the next great turning point, Brexit. The 2016 decision to leave the EU wasn't some sudden shock. It was really the culmination of a long, complicated, and often pretty standoffish relationship Britain has always had with the rest of Europe.
And this is where the politics get really tricky, because criticism of the European Union was never a simple left versus right issue. For decades, you could find major voices on both sides of the aisle, from the socialist Tony Benn to the conservative Peter Hitchens, all worried about a loss of national sovereignty. Then the 2008 financial crisis just poured gasoline on that fire, and tensions grew over things like free movement and regional inequality, especially in those old industrial areas. It was a really complex debate with deep roots across the entire political spectrum.
All of this brings us right back to today, and to that central question hanging over the nation's future. After 400 years of rising, falling, and totally reinventing itself, what comes next?
There's this one sharp observation that I think just perfectly captures the modern dilemma. Maybe Britain can't keep bringing up that it built the world. That card has been played too many times. The point is, just relying on your past glories might not be the best strategy for dealing with today's challenges.
So this all leads to one defining question, doesn't it? Has Britain's long, complicated history prepared it for another great comeback? Or, after centuries right at the center of the world stage, is it finally time to just retire gracefully? The answer to that question is what's going to define its future.